You've heard you can make more power on E85. What exactly is it and how do you prepare your car for it? I'm going to explain that today on Passion for Performance. So James has asked me about running E85 in his car. Currently he puts out about 450 wheel horsepower in a 1996 WRX STI, also known as the GC8. It's reasonably modified with a built engine, some cylinder head work, larger cams and a Borg Warner EFR 7670. It's all powered currently by an aftermarket Link ECU. So we're going to disregard that now and start with the basics. The first thing we want to know is exactly what is E85. So E85 is a blend of fuel that's becoming more and more common. It is 85% ethanol, thus the E85, and 15% gasoline. This can vary, however, and typically does throughout the year. This is more prominent in colder climates. Ethanol is quite hard to ignite, so what they do is during the cold periods of the year they put more gasoline in the mixture, and it can vary down to E60 in some cases. This means it's 60% ethanol and 40% gasoline. It makes it easy to ignite. However, it does have detrimental effects on power, and your car ideally, if it's going to be used with fuel that varies that much, would be able to compensate. So let's talk about that as well. Flex fuel. Flex fuel is another option when converting to E85. Flex fuel allows you to run ethanol, E85, all the way down to complete pump gas, and anywhere in the middle. This is particularly convenient for a road car, however flex fuel is not available on all applications. Flex fuel is particularly helpful if you want to be able to fill up with E85 to go to the track or have that little bit more performance. However, if you need to splash a bit of 98 in to get home or anything like that, you are perfectly safe to do so because the ECU and that system is designed to compensate, and it will change things in the background that will likely reduce your power. However, it will keep your engine safe and running in an optimal state. So how exactly does E85 give you more power? I'm not going to go too deep into the science behind it, but basically you are going to be injecting more fuel. What that means is more fuel being injected into the cylinder gives it a better cooling effect. If you have less temperature inside your engine, inside the cylinder, you can add more boost in a turbocharged engine and more ignition timing. These things typically, in the right engine, will help increase power. Another advantage you typically see is the engine will run slightly colder and you get better turbo response. Now you know a little bit more about E85, let's talk about what you need to do to ready your car and its fuel system for ethanol. The first thing to know is E85 is horrible stuff. It's corrosive and will eat anything in your fuel system that is not designed to be used with E85. This means the fuel injectors, fuel lines, fuel rails, fuel tank, everything needs to be prepared for E85. Just keep that in the back of your mind. I've seen many instances where people haven't properly prepared or selected the right stuff in their fuel system and it ended up in tears. Either a lack of power, something holding them back, poor reliability, or the worst case scenario is stuff starts to deteriorate, block up injectors, and then you don't get adequate supply of fuel under power. That's very dangerous, and it can cause your engine to run lean and blow stuff up. Obviously not something we want. However, if you have careful planning and choose the right components, you can have great success and reliability. There are a couple of reasons why E85 is quite corrosive. It's alcohol based, and this is simply not what standard automotive components are designed to be used for. The other reason is the fuel is quite hygroscopic. Now this means it absorbs moisture, and typically moisture and lots of components in your vehicle such as steel and alloy will corrode if they are exposed to excessive amounts of moisture. So this is something we want to keep in mind as well. The first component we're going to look at is the fuel injector. I've already discussed that you're going to make gains from ethanol because you inject more fuel. Now this means your entire fuel system, starting or ending with the injector, whatever way you look at it, needs to be capable of flowing roughly 30 or 40% more fuel than it would if it was running on gasoline by itself. We also need to make sure that the fuel injector is capable of using E85. My preferred injectors are Injector Dynamics, and they have a very handy tool on their website that allows you to calculate the size of injector. We don't want to go too large in the size of injector we're going to use, otherwise you will have poor fuel control at idle and cruise. This is going to mean your car is probably not going to run super smoothly, and you're also potentially going to use more fuel than ideal. We'll just take a quick look at the Injector Dynamics fuel size calculator. If you want to take a look yourself, just go to injectordynamics.com/injector-selector. If you scroll down, you'll find on the left hand side of the page you fill in some information about your vehicle and about the fuel system being used. Start with some information about engine displacement. I'm going to use a 2-litre engine, 4-cylinder, 4 valves per cylinder. Boost, I'm going to say, is 30 psi. Next up we've got lambda at WOT. This means lambda, or the fuel mixture, at wide open throttle. The best practice here is to hit the little question mark and use the one from the example. This gives a number of 0.81 at wide open throttle, which is about right. Then a lambda at idle. If you click the question mark again, it will give you another suggestion which will work well in a turbocharged engine. Ethanol percentage. We're going to assume that roughly the most ethanol we're ever going to see in the system if we're running on E85 is 85%. Fuel pressure is something that needs to be considered and calculated when you are setting up your fuel system. In most cases, you're going to have a fuel base pressure of approximately 43 psi. Next up we have cam aggressiveness. 1 is completely stock and 10 is a full race cam. I intend on having a tough street cam, something that will be drivable on the road but also produce a significant power level, which I'm going to put in at about a 7. The last question here is the fuel system type. Are you going to be running a constant pressure or a boost reference 1-to-1 pressure? In most systems that use a fuel pressure regulator, this increases fuel pressure by 1 psi for every 1 psi of boost that is added. This means it's a boost reference 1-to-1 system. Now we can use this graph to decide what size fuel injector we want to run. Along the bottom of the graph are the different sizes. We have the ID725 on the left hand side, and on the right hand side we have the ID2000. If we look in the top left hand corner, there is a blue line. Looking at the key at the bottom of the chart, this indicates an ID850. At 5000 RPM, this injector is already at 90% capacity. Ideally, you don't want a fuel injector to go past around about 90% at its maximum point. This allows a bit of headroom and means that the fuel injector isn't always activated. It also allows a bit of headroom in the case of any voltage variation. So that injector is out, being that it's already at 90% at 5000 RPM. The next injector we have is the red line. This indicates on the key at the bottom an ID1000. You can see that this is approximately at 93% at 6,000 RPM. We want to be able to rev this engine out to at least 8,000 RPM, so that's not going to cut it either. Moving along, we've got the ID1050X. This gives slightly better flow, but only a tiny bit. Again, it's not going to cut the mustard. Now we've got a purple line, the ID1300X. Now this is looking a little bit closer to where we want to be. At 5,000 RPM we're at 60% duty cycle. At 6,000 RPM we're at 72% duty cycle. And at 7,500 RPM we're at 90% duty cycle. So this is almost there, but not quite. We're going to bump it up one more, the ID1700X. Now this looks like it's going to be pretty damn perfect. At 8,000 RPM, which is where we want to rev this engine to, it's at just under 80% duty cycle. That means it's pretty much perfect for the application. It's not too large, so we're going to have the best control that we can, and it is definitely large enough for what we want to do, and it's going to have some suitable headroom. If, for instance, we had a slightly smaller injector that we wanted to make do, we could increase the base fuel pressure. If I increase the base fuel pressure from 43 to 50, you're going to see a slight difference in this map. Let's focus on the purple ID1300X, because that was almost big enough for us, but not quite. We're at about 91% at 7,500 RPM. If we increase the base fuel pressure from 43 psi to 50 psi, that would make an ID1300 capable of the power we're after. At 8,000 RPM, we would be capable of running in the 90% duty cycle range. This is still a little bit close for me, and if I was purchasing these injectors, I would definitely go for the size up. However, if they were already in there, it would be possible to make them work. I would likely slightly increase the fuel pressure a couple psi more, so we've got that tiny bit of headroom. If we go to 53 psi, then we have roughly another 4% of headroom looking at this map. In the same way that the injector needs to be able to flow more fuel, the fuel pump also needs to be able to supply the fuel injectors with more fuel. Again, roughly 30 or 40%. I like to use a couple of magic numbers just to remind myself how much fuel is required to make a certain power level on different types of fuel. These numbers are just roundabout figures, as it does vary from engine to engine and fuel system to fuel system. We'll start with pump gas just to give you a bit of an idea. The general rule of thumb is you need 100 litres per hour of flow to make 200 horsepower at the engine. Now, when people talk about power, they typically don't want to make power at the engine, they want to make it to the wheels. I'm going to make it a bit simpler. We're going to work with the at the wheel power figures. You're going to need roughly 100 litres per hour of fuel flow to make in the ballpark of 170 horsepower. This equates to about 125 kilowatt. If you're going to be running on E85, this changes significantly. You're going to need roughly 100 litres per hour of fuel flow to make 130 horsepower, or about 95 kilowatt. Now these numbers are a little bit conservative, however I recommend staying on the conservative side, particularly with the fuel pump, so you're going to get good fuel flow and fuel pressure to the fuel injectors where you need it most. Another thing to consider with fuel pumps is the wiring. It's important that they have good voltage and current supply. That isn't going to be a limiting factor. The pumps are generally rated at about 14 volts. However, if your charging system's only working at 13.5 volts, and then you have long wiring throughout the car that's degraded with age, it's quite feasible they're only getting about 12.5 volts directly to the fuel pump. That means it's not going to be running at the rated litres per hour. If you want to make the most of a fuel pump, it's very common to run a supply directly from the alternator or battery to the fuel system. We now know we've got to have a reasonable sized pump that's compatible with E85 to supply the fuel injectors. But there is a gap in the middle. We likely have some hard lines throughout the vehicle, sections of rubber hose, and obviously the fuel rails where the injectors are situated. These all need to be specifically compatible with ethanol or E85. They also need to be large enough in diameter to flow the amount of fuel. Let's start by talking about the fuel rail. These are obviously unique to every single vehicle, so I would do some research to find out whether the fuel rail in your vehicle will flow enough and isn't restricted by, for instance, a factory fuel pressure regulator to be able to supply the volume of fuel that you're after. If you're only after a small increase in power, then it's highly likely your factory fuel rail may be up to the task. I know in the Subaru tuning world, people often upgrade the fuel rails prematurely. We've used factory fuel rails up to the 450 kilowatt mark. Any rubber hose used throughout the vehicle must be safe for use with ethanol. As we've discussed, ethanol is highly corrosive and it will eat away at any rubber that isn't designed for that use. It is now commonplace for manufacturers to fit ethanol compatible fuel hoses throughout the vehicle. Now, this is pretty fortunate, as in older vehicles where you need to replace the rubber hoses, this can be a significant amount of work as you have to drop the fuel tank out of the vehicle. There are often rubber hoses on top of the tank, as well as throughout the engine bay and sometimes along the route of the hardline. These will all need to be replaced with something that is suitable. Lastly, any hard lines in your vehicle need to be considered whether they are suitable for use with ethanol. This comes down both to diameter and also the material they are made out of. Commonly, if they're made from steel, they will be okay for use with E85, however, their diameter may not flow enough for the system. In a regular Japanese performance vehicle, most cars have a single 8mm fuel feed line. This is typically suitable for use with a single in-tank or even out-of-tank pump, providing it doesn't flow excessively highly. If you're going to be upgrading to a dual pump type system, this is likely the point where you need to upgrade to a larger fuel supply. I would suggest that a -6 line is suitable for up to around 600 wheel horsepower, and anything above that will require a -8. -8 is large enough to take you beyond the 1000 horsepower mark. You'll also need to consider the return supply back to the tank. If you've got a great big feed line and your vehicle is only idling, you're going to have increased fuel pressure if the return line back to the tank is a tiny straw. It's going to increase the fuel pressure at idle, and that can create other issues for the tuner. Ideally, you would have a return line of a similar or the same size. In vehicles that are pushing substantial power but there is a limited budget, it's reasonably commonplace to fabricate or make a larger hard line throughout the vehicles to supply the engine with fuel, and then use the standard fuel feed line as a return. This gives a larger line for both feeding and returning fuel back to the tank. So where is all of the fuel stored in your vehicle? The fuel tank, obviously. We need to consider that you're going to chew through more fuel, and typically it's not feasible to replace with a larger tank. However, some models such as the WRX and STI are available with a few different variations, with the Spec C coming with a very small tank from factory. However, you can get a standard model WRX tank in some cases that will bolt directly in and has approximately 15 litres greater capacity. That is very handy. The thing we need to be more vigilant of is the inside of the tank. If the tank is made of steel, it's important that we don't let ethanol sit inside the tank for prolonged periods. This is going to attract moisture, and that moisture will likely attack the steel. If you use Uncle Google, there are some coatings you can get to protect the inside of your tank. However, in most applications this isn't the case. I suggest doing a bit of research and talking to other people that are running the same type of vehicle and or tank as you to find out if they're having any issues with build-up or corrosion inside the tank. As we've noted, ethanol is pretty damn corrosive. It's commonly accepted in the automotive industry that you shouldn't leave ethanol to sit in a vehicle for a long period of time. In fact, if you've got a flex fuel setup, it's preferable to run it on pumped gasoline before turning it off for a long period of time. This means that that dry, corrosive fuel is no longer left sitting in all of the lines and the fuel injectors, which can be damaged if it's left to sit in the fuel lines, rails, injectors and fuel pump for a long period of time. We've effectively gone through the entire fuel system and made sure it's ready for use with ethanol. However, we need to consider the ECU. Is the ECU that your car has tunable? Does it have the ability to be tuned with larger injectors for E85? Best of all, does it have the ability to be tuned for flex fuel? These are all questions you need to ask to the person that will be tuning your vehicle. Ultimately, you need to make sure that your ECU is capable of what you want, and if it's not, then there are many aftermarket solutions that you can look at. When I look at an aftermarket ECU, it is very important that it has flex fuel capability, so it can be tuned for use on multiple fuels. The injector needs to be selected to be compatible with both the fuel rail and fit your engine, and also the ECU. Injectors typically come with a high or low resistance, and some are not compatible with all types of ECUs. If your factory or current ECU isn't compatible with either the injectors, flex fuel, or your desires for what you want your car to do, then there are plenty of great aftermarket options available. Whether you want to run flex fuel or not, it's always a recommendation that you run a flex fuel sensor. This is a flex fuel sensor that I've got for one of my own projects. It is a GM sensor, however it has been branded by AEM. These work by passing the fuel returning to the fuel tank through this hose. It measures the resistance across the fuel to calculate the ethanol content. If there is contamination of water in the fuel, however, it does create issues with the ethanol percentage reading. That is another reason you really want to avoid letting E85 sit for a long period of time, as it will absorb water out of the air. The reason you want to have an ethanol content sensor in your system is it will allow your tuner to add compensations so that your ECU compensates for the different mixtures of E85. If you get a particularly strong mixture on one day, where it might be 85 or 88% ethanol, and then on a day that's much colder throughout the year and the fuel company has watered down the mixture and it's only E60, that's going to have quite different running requirements for your engine. This sensor will mean that your engine runs safely throughout the different mixture range. In the same way, if you are running a complete flex fuel system, this will allow your ECU to completely compensate. If you're running solely pump gas, this sensor is going to tell your ECU so, and it's going to dial down the power a little bit, but it's going to keep your engine in a safe condition. I hope you've learned a little bit more about running ethanol or a flex fuel setup in your vehicle. If you want to know more, or you've got any other questions about your performance vehicle at all, let me know in the comments below and I'll be sure to make a video to answer them. Have a good one, guys.